It is currently about 9 a.m., Tuesday, February 21st, 2023. And I just saw a video by Omar Gonzalez about, common photography questions as posed by ChatGPT. And I wanted to talk a little bit about it because one of the first questions that came up was, what is a good camera for a beginner photographer? And Omar Gonzalez's response was, it depends on what kind of photography you want to do. And also, uh, compared to say 10, 15 years ago when phones started to become the dominant way people took pictures, compared to say 20, 30 years ago, which was when digital photography took over for film. And compare that to maybe like, I don't know, 50, 60 years ago when photography became pretty commonplace amongst the masses. And then compare that to like 100 years ago when, photography was a relatively new thing. And so, yeah, that's one of the things I want to talk about is just exactly what photography today even means. And then the other subject matter it kind of touches upon is that I wanted to cover in a video but never got around to is why the Fuji X-T200 that I bought for my wife was such a fail. But anyway, I wanted to quickly talk about why I disagree with Omar Gonzalez's answer regarding what camera to get as a beginner. First of all, I think as a beginner, you probably should get a Sony mirrorless camera. That I'm going to make it real easy right there. The reason being because first he says, it depends on what kind of photography you want to do. The truth is, I think most cameras can take all kinds of photos, right? They may not necessarily be the best kind of camera for each application, but as a beginner photographer, you're probably not going to be shooting pro sports, right? So you don't need a dedicated sports camera like an A1, right? And you're not necessarily going to do product photography, so you don't need a medium format camera, right? So like the truth is, like a general purpose entry level to like enthusiast level Sony mirrorless camera is going to cover you as a beginner. Number two, and this is a very important part, is that photography today is different compared to photography 20, 30, 40 years ago. Now, if you're a beginner photographer, you're probably coming in from a smartphone. And what that means is you probably never have to think about focus. And that's why I disagree with Omar Gonzalez about going with a DSLR camera, because for DSLR cameras, you do have to think about focus. And so even though DSLR cameras are very good at focusing, compared to say a contrast based system, the truth is it still uses a phase detect focusing array, and you have to focus using the array, which is something that I didn't know when I first started in photography. Whereas with the mirrorless camera, you don't have to worry about that array because the focus points cover almost the entire sensor. So that's why I truly do think a mirrorless camera is the way to go, not DSLR. And the reason why I say Sony is because Sony is the best, hands down, the best when it comes to autofocus. Now, others have caught up. Canon has a very good autofocus system as well. But, you can't really go wrong either with the Sony. The other thing that Omar mentioned was lenses. You think based on lenses. But again, I disagree with him there because you can get any kind of lens for any kind of system. And in terms of pricing, they're not that different. I would say probably the outlier is Fuji. Their lenses tend to be more expensive. But the truth is, mirrorless mount camera lenses between the companies are generally fairly close, and they pretty much cover all the focal lengths and speed that you might need, right? Obviously, don't go with a Canon M mount camera because that mount is basically dead. But again, this kind of goes in line with what I said earlier, which is Sony mirrorless, because like you can get so many different kinds of lenses for that, not just from Sony but also third party. And one other point, so this is kind of in keeping with what I was saying earlier about why the Fuji X-T200 is such a fail. I would not go Fuji, just because Fuji fails in that its autofocus is not very good, to the point that as a beginner you're probably not going to prefer it over your smartphone. Number two, the first party lenses tend to be pretty expensive. And then, even though it's a very pretty camera, which is a big draw for beginner photographers, I personally find myself reaching for the X-T200 a lot simply because of its good looks. The truth is that it's far harder to achieve the results that you're looking for with the Fuji cameras compared to Sony, and that will tend to discourage you from using the camera as opposed to your smartphone. So anyway, those are my thoughts on what you should get as a beginner photographer.